Good morning, everybody. I'll repeat the thanks for everybody's attendance today and attention. Once again, Judge has done it. There he goes again. He's assembled just the right panel, just the right topic, just the right time. It's being videoed this time. This kind of reminds me in my teaching, sometimes we have to record the classes, and so everybody has to remember to refrain from vulgar language and such like. So we'll all be minding our P's and Q's a little bit extra. I just have about 2 minutes of pot stirring to do, since the folks that you really want to hear from are lined up here to my left. And you'll notice, I guess, right off the get-go that there are 3, but not 4, diplomatic presences on this panel, and missing in action is somebody who can speak for Uncle Sam, which I certainly can't do. But what I thought maybe I would do instead, in order to get us rolling here, is to just very briefly click through what it seems that we may be aiming for, or think that we're doing, or think that we would like to do in regard to the EU and in regard to NAFTA. Just as a consumer of the news and observer events like you all are, because you know, if you go on the basis of sort of rhetoric and visible behavior, there is a little that you can see. So anyway, for what it's worth, and this may be some of what we'll hear addressed by our fearless panelists. So what do we think we're doing, want to do with regard to the EU? Well, we're interested in Brexit and in our future trade relationship with the United Kingdom. It appears that we're very interested in how the EU handles the evolution of its own policy with regard to China and market economy status and anti-dumping. That issue has been elevated. We seem to be displaying some combination of resentment and envy in regard to the European approach to taxation, business taxation. And there I refer not only to, you know, I guess the situation, the attractiveness of jurisdictions like Ireland, but the sort of heavy use of border adjustment across most of Europe. We seem perfectly willing to contemplate zapping EU exports in the context of global trade actions, like the ones under 232, like the ones that are now going forward under Section 201. We would like the EU to be a little bit less successful in propagating its views on geographic indications and which food and beverage products are geographically distinctive. And by the way, I don't know, I guess given who we have represented here, maybe we can sort this out, but I read just in this morning's beverage alcohol press about an interesting one involving Heineken's placing in the market of a tequila-infused beer, which has offended the sensibilities of the folks in Mexico responsible for that geographically distinctive product. So maybe we can get that sorted out before we wrap up.
Try it. Why not?
We're not showing much inclination, as far as I can tell, to work with the EU in some of the traditional ways. For example, on a good package of deliverables for the next WTO ministerial, which is not far off. And oh yes, for the moment at least, we're content to leave the TTIP in an undead state and continue skirmishing over aerospace subsidies. Okay, what about NAFTA? We apparently would like to wring out non-North American content as fully as possible from the goods that have NAFTA eligibility. We want to claim or reclaim some manufacturing employment that has settled itself in Mexico. And we would like to have a smaller bilateral merchandise trade deficit with Mexico. We want to extract concessions from Canada on some offensive issues, most notably dairy trade. I'll let you decide what the word offensive modifies in all of that. it could be our behavior in relation to dairy trade. We want to overhaul some of the NAFTA's institutional provisions and dispute resolution provisions, and most notably the ones that sit in chapters 19 and 11. We want to really have a new, or continue our new mania for Buy American, meaning that we want to apparently refrain from deepening the NAFTA in regard to government procurement, and that matters because our NAFTA partners have some interesting requests and proposals in that category. And we seem to want to continue to treat even the highest profile trade remedy proceedings, example, softwood lumber for Canada, sugar for Mexico, as basically matters of pure law enforcement, as opposed to some part of our trade policy that we would be prepared to bargain over. So that's from a distance, and based on reading the headlines, that seems to be what we have in mind and think we're about with regard to the NAFTA. So very different from a statement that you might have gotten from a USTR official about what U.S. policy really is. But anyway, perhaps that stirs the pot for the purposes of what you are now going to be treated to from our fearless panelists. We'll start, I believe we're to start with Francisco Sandoval Saki, who serves as economic advisor in the Trade and NAFTA office that's connected to Mexico's embassy here in Washington, D.C. The Trade and NAFTA office is in charge of promoting the Mexico-U.S. relationship, working on both sort of internal to NAFTA issues and also global issues that affect the NAFTA region. He has some prior service at Economia, which is Mexico's Ministry of Economy, advising the Undersecretary for International Trade Negotiations and handling statistical and economic analyses. And he holds degrees in economics from 2 autonomous institutes, which means that they are free of government control, apparently. One being the University of Nuevo Leon, and then the Autonomous Institute of Technology. Next, we'll hear from Colin Bird, on my immediate left, who is the Minister Counselor, and then his parenthetical says Trade and Economic Policy, Minister Counselor for Trade and Economic Policy at the Embassy of Canada. Prior to this posting, he held senior jobs in the trade negotiations branch of DFAIT, and has also worked in the NAFTA Secretariat and in Canada's Trade Law Bureau on some minor matters like aerospace and softwood lumber. And he has represented Canada in WTO dispute settlement before panels in the appellate body. He's a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada. I, for one, would like to leave here today knowing what part of Canada is Upper Canada. And the proud holder of a law degree from the University of Ottawa, as well as a bachelor's degree from Harvard. And then last, on the far left, Damien Levie, head of the Trade and Agriculture section at the Delegation of the EU. Is relatively recent arrival here in Washington, and before getting here, he worked in the cabinet of EU Trade Commissioner Karel de Gucht, and headed DG Trade's USA and Canada team, was a lead EU negotiator on TTIP, and along the path has handled some non-trade issues in his service within the Commission, stuff like merger control, chemical regulation, development policy in Africa, and, oh yes, European economic integration. Also some time in private practice, but my favorite thing on this resume is his presidency of the Belgian Alumni Club of the University of Chicago. So with that, please kick us off and let us know what we really need to understand.
Yeah. Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, not to try to explain a little bit what is the Mexico's point of view regarding international trade negotiations, in particular with the European Union. That is the point of this discussion. And I would like to start not just with a little snapshot about what is Mexico right now. Mexico has built a solid framework of macroeconomic stability in the past two decades. And that has bring us economic growth, steady economic growth. Currently, Mexico, well, this economy of over $1 trillion is the 50th largest economy in the world. And we trade about $780 billion globally. That place Mexico among the 10th largest exporter, the first in Latin America, and the 9th largest importer in the world. But that is for emerging economy. It was very important for Mexico not to try to engage and embrace globalization and open markets in the very beginning of our process of entering into the global economy that was decided basically 3 decades ago. And as a result of this decision, the Mexican economy had a significant transformation in its economy composition, and trade played a very important role. In the very beginning, when we decided to open our economy, trade as a percentage of your GDP was around 30% of Mexico's total production value, and currently it's around 70%. That is one of the highest, or the highest percentage in North America, just followed by Canada with over 50% of the economy is trade, and the United States, which that ratio settles in 20%. But our view about open markets and free trade is not just to increase the amount of trade that we conduct with the rest of the world, is to have a real impact in our economy. And that happened in Mexico along over 30 years of open markets. We experienced a significant transformation of the economy, where in the early 80s, Mexico exported around 80% in oil. Currently, Mexico exports 90% in manufacturing products. And that was the result of embracing open market, and unilaterally, multilaterally, and bilaterally. So as a result, Mexico has constructed a network of free trade agreements with 46 countries, which account 70% of the world GDP, 2/3 of the global imports, and has access to 1 billion consumers. Currently, Mexico has a free trade agreement with the most important economies in the world: North America, United States, Canada, the European Union, and our strategic partners in Latin America, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Central America, Japan. But we want to continue opening our economy, and we recognize that what we negotiated 20 years ago, 30 years ago, needs to be updated and modernized, and we don't need to stop in what we have achieved in terms of market access to the rest of the world. And that is the reason that we are continuing negotiating with different countries that we visualize that as a strategic. We are negotiating with Turkey and Jordan currently, and we are updating our trade relationship with Brazil and Argentina. We continue working in the trade initiative with the countries of the Pacific Alliance. In parallel, we are modernizing, and we decided to modernize our relationship with the European Union. And that has a key element in our view free trade agreement network, to the 21st century altogether. So, and the European Union is a key partner that we agree to modernize our trade relationship. That is the point of view of Mexico. For us, the European Union is the third largest trading partner, just after North America, our NAFTA partners, and China, and represent a trade exchange of over $60 billion. We export around $20 billion to the European Union, and we import around $40 billion, from the European Union. Definitely, we have a trade deficit with the European Union, but we are not complaining about that. We know that the nature of this trade is complements our economic structure. So, and that's just important. There are sectors that in Mexico are buying components and intermediate products from the European countries, in particular, and in the automotive industry. So we had developed a strong relationship, a trade relationship with the automotive powerhouses in the European Union, in particular with Germany. And Germany is taking the role of being the backbone in the Mexico-EU trade relationship. And to say that, well, currently Secretary Guajardo, Mexico's Secretary Guajardo, and European Union Commissioner Cecilia Malmström decided last year to embark in this modernization process. As of today, we had had 3 rounds of negotiations. The first 2 were more basically about planning and let's agree what we want in the agreement. And the third round of negotiation, which took place in Brussels, I think, in April. We saw a significant progress in all the elements that the agreement, the modernization of the agreement is going to take. Just to mention, the current Mexico-European Union Free Trade Agreement includes only 9 chapters. And the current negotiation is contemplated to expand the numbers of disciplines to around 16 chapters in order to, of course, include disciplines regarding e-commerce, regulatory harmonizations, improving services, expanding disciplines in investment, and some other disciplines that we need in order to continue expanding our trade relationship. Just to conclude, well, recently both chief negotiator, the Secretary Guajardo and Mrs. Malmström, well, just agreed to speed up the process. We are intending to finalize the free trade agreement this year. There are 3 rounds of negotiations already scheduled for this year. Actually, next week in Mexico City is going to take place the 4th round, and the 5th round is going to take place in Brussels in September. We hope that by the 6th round that we scheduled in November, everything is going to be basically ready to wrap it up. Of course, we are thinking that is NAFTA negotiations are about to start in August or September. That is going to absorb resources, and we need to move fast and cover the most of the content of the new negotiations currently. Thank you.
Colin?
Well, thanks very much. And Judge, I think it's very timely panel to have, certainly from a Canadian perspective, as we're on the verge of applying the CETA agreement. Transatlantic trade is very much top of mind on the Canadian trade agenda. But what I'd like to do, I think, is just sort of give you a sense of what's the mood on trade in Canada. Talk a little bit more about the CETA and the Transatlantic Alliance from Canada's perspective, which I think really then flows into a conversation about NAFTA, because if you're looking to see what Canada means by modernization and updating of NAFTA, I don't think you have to look very far from the CETA to have a sense of what that is. Just a sense of where Canada is nationally. We are probably at one of the most unified places I've ever seen Canada on trade, and I think for those of you whose memory goes back to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement at the end of the 80s, there was a lot of nationalist concerns about sovereignty, and when that negotiation took place, we had an election campaign that was really fought over the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, high levels of concern in civil society. Very different place now. There's a real sense of self-confidence in Canada on trade. That's partially because some of the worst fears about what Canada-U.S. FTA and then NAFTA would mean in terms of the Canadian economy did not materialize. Instead, we saw a vast expansion in trade and vast expansion in the capacity of Canadian firms to compete globally. So you also saw, I think there's been a real outreach effort that has been quite successful from the past government, the current government of Canada, to engage with all sorts of actors in Canada who have traditionally been skeptical about trade agreements. And I think that's in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership consultations, that was in the context of CETA process. And the CETA negotiations were really a novel experience for Canada in terms of bringing provinces and the government and the federal government into the process early. But the process of having the conversations that were respectful and engaged with civil society has tempered a lot of the anxieties about trade. And so you saw when we brought into when we were successful on the European side of moving CETA into ratification mode, you had a hug across the aisle between our current trade minister, or our trade minister at the time, and our foreign trade minister, different parties, but it demonstrated a sort of across the board consensus on trade. And a lot of that was because of the focus in the CETA context, not only on a modern trade agreement that would reduce barriers and improve trade, but on a progressive trade agenda that also talked about environment, labor, and transparency. And so it's a very different conversation that we're having in Canada. And it's a conversation that I think stands us in good stead as we go into a conversation about NAFTA. Certainly we are, I think, very, very close to application of the CETA. You'll have seen that the EU has completed all of its steps necessary before going into provisional application back in February. Canada's implementing legislation cleared our parliament last month. We're in the very final stages of doing all the regulatory changes that are necessary to bring it into force. And so we're looking at a very imminent provisional application. And when you're talking provisional application, it sounds very tentative. In reality, it means essentially full application of the CETA, with the exception of certain investor issues that are in member state competence. So what does that mean? You're looking at a 98% of tariff lines going duty-free as of day one, as soon as we bring it into force. We've got fairly concise phase-outs for those very sensitive products in the sort of 3, 5, 7-year range, so that we'll be at over about 99% of tariff lines duty-free by the time the phase-ins are complete. You have within the agreement labor, environment, transparency provisions, consultation mechanisms, very carefully designed to address some of the concerns we've been hearing from our civil society about how a trade agreement needs to focus more on an inclusive approach to addressing trade. Just as an aside, I think the Canadian government has also been quite effective at focusing the attention on, from a trade perspective, on the domestic suite of policies that are necessary to succeed and prosper in a globalized world. And that is certainly, I think, taken some of the heat off of, Canada, just like the United States. While we've seen our manufacturing input and our productivity increase quite dramatically, the number of jobs in many of our traditional manufacturing sectors has seen the same experience in Ontario and Quebec as you see in Ohio and Michigan. But there has been, I think, a better conversation internally about what measures, what economic measures we need to put in place in our economy to be able to succeed in a more innovative, in a changing workplace. So if you look at the CETA from a Canadian perspective, you have both sort of the progressive trade agenda elements to it that I've just mentioned. You've got the modernization elements, the regulatory cooperation chapter, the focus on, if you look at what we do in terms of movement of natural persons, it's quite innovative. For intra-corporate transfers, you have the ability to bring family and a lot more sensitivity to the realities of how businesses try to work across borders. You look at the level of ambition on government procurement, and it's really quite dramatic, so that we're down at the provincial, the member state, and the city level in terms of openness to procurement. From an economy like Canada's, which is very much anchored and rooted in the North American trading environment, that we now have an agreement going into application with the Europeans that in many ways, certainly on government procurement, certainly on labor mobility issues, it's the most ambitious agreement, I think, for both of the EU and for Canada on services, that we've had an agreement that has essentially leapfrogged NAFTA, does help make the case for the modernization and the updating of NAFTA that we are trying to embark on. And so that, when you saw the results of the campaign rhetoric on NAFTA and a certain challenge to orthodoxy on the U.S. side, I think the response from Canada was a very open response to the possibility of modernization and updating. And I think you have to look no further than the CETA model to see what Canada means by that. And to be candid, we also have to look at what the climate for negotiations is going to be going forward. And there are many places, there are some very positive signals. So the level of engagement at the very senior levels of our government and the United States government and with the Mexicans, I think has been very positive. And so the sense of outreach, the openness that we've experienced from the new U.S. administration in terms of dialogue has been encouraging for us. If you look at the response to industry in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada, to the prospect of a NAFTA negotiation, I think you've seen across the North American continent a real coming together in terms of wanting to keep the focus on how do we move the NAFTA forward, how do we get a NAFTA 2.0 rather than a NAFTA 0.8. And that's, I think a credit to the business community in all three countries that they are recognizing the importance of doing no harm, moving the ball forward as opposed to moving backward. Are there going to be challenges? Are there going to be bumps in the road as we go forward? Absolutely. But the rhetoric around America first and economic nationalism that we're hearing in the United States does not necessarily have to translate into a win-lose model. And Canada is very focused on keeping a win-win model going forward into these negotiations, or a win-win-win model going forward into these negotiations. And I have to say, in terms of the tripartite nature of NAFTA, you had, I think there's always a bit of jealousy in Canada about the special relationship we feel that we have with the United States. And so there was not necessarily a full embrace, I think, in many parts of Canada of moving into the tripartite model. I think that is we're in a very changed environment now, and the recognition that supplies and inputs from Mexico make Canadian goods more competitive globally is much more understood, and the value of the massive increase that we've seen in Canada-US trade under the NAFTA and its impact on Canadian prosperity is well understood. But there are, of course, challenges in terms of managing an agreement going forward, particularly when you do have rhetoric that can sometimes look win-lose. And you can also, when we do look at the national security investigations on steel and aluminum, when we look at trade remedy enforcement measures, particularly on the softwood lumber file or on the where we're expecting a dumping decision later today. Those are all elements that are going to have an impact on the environment going forward into a negotiation. Where there is, I think, real agreement amongst the three parties is that we will be all better served once we have predictability and stability in the marketplace going forward. That argues for as rapid a conclusion of negotiations as we can do. Canada has now launched its own consultation process with Canadians. Formal submissions in that process are due July 18th. That will set us up for the conversation about what the specific negotiation objectives are, which I'm sure that John will push me hard on. So I'll leave it there.
Speaking of win-win-win, Damien, the floor is yours if you want it, but it would be fully understandable. Some of your thunder has been I won't say stolen, but anyway, please.
No, not stolen, not at all. And I'm happy I contributed to our ambassador's remarks. I'll be very brief. One, I think we should not forget that most of the growth will happen outside Europe. And I remember there was one of the two candidates last year was saying the same, that most of the economic growth globally will take place outside the United States. Therefore, we need to tap into that growing market, and that explains why we're doing all these trade deals or negotiations, because we want to make sure our companies do have a growing share of that growing market. Second, elections in Europe this year, which we've seen quite a few, do not prevent us from negotiating. We have more than 10 or a dozen deals ongoing, and one has sometimes the impression, oh, Europe is in a crisis, elections constantly. Well, actually the machine continues, and we've ratified CETA, and we will have no doubt ratified Vietnam and Singapore, so that will create and conclude, as the ambassador said, probably a political agreement on Japan. That's the way we do it, as our Canadian friends know very well. So the machine continues, and Brexit does not prevent us from moving. You've probably heard the noise from Brussels and the Council, European Council, so the meeting of heads of states and government. They want to go forward, not discuss Brexit too much, but still see how we can further solidify, consolidate the European Union and make sure it's up to the job of the current challenges. On Brexit, a word just to explain, if not everybody has understood what's going on. So we are in these 2 years, but actually we're talking about 18 months, maybe 16 months, because we need to conclude by October, November 2018, because then we need to translate, because that's the beauty of Europe. It's not a pluribus unum, it's, you know, unity in plurality of languages. And so we have 23 official languages, and then we need Parliament and Council to ratify the result of negotiations. So we don't have much time, and in a way we've reduced that period of time with the elections that took place in the UK. And we've proposed to structure the talks in 3 phases. Phase 1, we need to deal with the financial consequences of leaving. If the EU were to stop existing tomorrow, well, I'd be out of job, of course, but that's not the main concern, of course. I would not be the only one in the room, by the way. But the EU has taken on legal commitments to build roads, satellites, finance research projects, do many, many things, also development projects. So what we call the reste à liquider, even in English, it's the RAL. There are unfunded liabilities of the EU, and the UK has a share of that. Of course, the UK has a share of the assets, which we've never put a price tag on, but we've never had to. That's going to be an interesting exercise. Put a price tag on a government building or government assets. Some may have negative value, I suppose. Not buildings, but assets. That's one. So the money part, tricky, of course. The citizens part, very tricky. More than 4 million people, and we deal with the right to live in a country, the right to have access to social security, medical insurance, the right to pension. You've lived 10 years here, 10 years there, 10 years there, you work there, and you're British, you've done that in 3 or 4 countries of the European Union, and then you want to take your pension or retire in Spain. Well, you need to have access to social security, medical, and so forth and so forth, with no discrimination. The right to still marry and have your spouse come and live with you permanently. The children, the recognition of professional qualifications. You are a doctor, you are entitled to work in the UK, you are a French doctor, a Belgian doctor. The continuation of that right. And if you read the negotiating guidelines, which are public, as you know, on the European side would be very transparent and very detailed. So our position is out there. It's pretty complex. And the judicial resolution of all the disputes, because as we know, you set up rules, we don't have much time to do that. Then there'll be a lot of unforeseen circumstances, details, cases. What is the mechanism to adjudicate the disputes between the citizens and the national authorities of that relevant state? What is the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? From our side, the European Court of Justice must stay part of the resolution mechanism. And then we have the border issues with Ireland in particular. The second phase is the framework for the future relationship. We cannot negotiate a deal with the UK concerning the future relationship as long as they are not out. So we can agree on goals, on the framework, but they need to be out so that we can start the formal negotiations with them. And the third phase, all that in 16 to 18 months. The third phase is the transition agreement. So what do we do in the transition between the current situation they are in, future relationship, the bespoke agreement that the ambassador talked about? What is it that we keep in between? China, just one word on anti-dumping. We are moving to upgrading or modifying our anti-dumping regulations or laws in a way to bringing them closer to the US system in order to keep using the analog country methodology when we have to. I will not respond to your comments on tax. I take note of your of your remark on our successful GI policy. Don Ackerman, Dutch agricultural counselor here, may take the question on Heineken and tequila-infused beer. No, I'm just joking. And indeed, we do want the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires to deliver a substantive outcome. We do think the world economy needs more rules in the areas where we're proposing rules, and we hope we will convince between now and December, although there isn't much time, the US administration to agree on substantive outcomes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know what kind of a time window we have here for 5 to 10 minutes will be our maximum. If there are questions for these excellent panelists, and please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. You've not had a question yet. I would suggest maybe we start over here.
Hi, my name's Eric Cathy, and I'm a congressional staffer. There's currently an inspection of ISDS provisions in the new NAFTA renegotiation. And opponents argue that the provisions could usurp national sovereignty of the trading partners. Can you elaborate or give us your thoughts on these sovereignty issues and whether they should be removed, strengthened, or be unchanged in the NAFTA renegotiation? I guess this would be a question to Mr. Bird and Mr. Ramos.
So in the again, looking at the CETA context, there is certainly considerable willingness on the part of Canada to look at the model, see how we can make it. There are a number of issues that we hear in our polity about ISDS. It has been an issue in Canada. Canada's faced a number of cases that we could argue are frivolous so it has certainly been an issue that Canada has been prepared to take a look at. We've got the model that we were looking at in the TPP, the model in CETA, where you're looking at sort of more robust measures to address, to avoid regulatory chill, more focus on mediation, looking at how you can have avoid conflicts in terms of who is actually appointed on the panels. But fundamentally, Canada is a big believer in investor-state protection. We see that there is the value of that sort of predictability and stability for Canadian investors has always been an important component of our trade policy agenda. And so we're certainly prepared to have a conversation about ISDS and look for innovative ideas that can ensure that there is both domestic political support in all three NAFTA countries for the system.
Regarding Mexico, our consultation process is still ongoing, task. Definitely, we will going to listen our industry, our private sector, what they would like to see in the current mechanism included in NAFTA. If they want to improve that mechanism, in which way they would like to conduct that improvement. But currently, they see that they like the current arrangement, but it is an opportunity definitely to ask the private sector if what kind of preference they have.
Just 2 points. One, the name of sovereignty, or the concern for sovereignty, we've used another name for the same issue. We've coined it the right to regulate. We need to protect the right to regulate from ISDS lawsuits. So we believe, for example, in our agreement with Canada in CETA, we've addressed the issue by defining what is the right to regulate and defining also the notion of indirect expropriation. And second, it's a technical question. Will NAFTA 2.0 modify Chapter 11 or add a new chapter? TPP did not replace the NAFTA Chapter 11, and so TPP was going to allow investors to choose between Chapter 11 rules or TPP ISDS chapters. So that's going to be, I think, a question that they will need to figure out. Do we modify existing rules, or do we add a new chapter on top of the existing? I don't know what they will do.
What about right in front of you, right there in the middle?
Hi, good morning. Oliver Moss from the Potomac Exchange. Just a question. What's your time frame? This is a question for Mr. Bird and Mr. Sandoval. Your time frame for a renegotiation for an updated NAFTA, because it would seem that you can't really start negotiations on a TTIP if you haven't sorted out an existing agreement that we've had in place for 20 years. So what are your thoughts, and what's the likelihood of something soon?
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, it's not a secret now for the Mexican government that the Mexican government prefers to see a very fast forward time schedule. If that is feasible to do, well, that is going to require the three governments' willingness to work very fast, to have negotiation runs basically back to back during the period that will be necessary in order to finalize the agreement by the end of this year. That is our preference. If that is going to be possible to achieve, well, we don't know. So, but at least we would like to work with that in mind, and start moving that line according with the necessary negotiations required.
I mean, there's always a tension between ambition and time frame, and certainly if your ambition is very broad and comprehensive and is touching on very sensitive sectors and issues in a negotiation, those tend to take longer. You know, our experience in negotiating the CETA was a launch in 2009, and here I am announcing an imminent entry into force. But there's also been a lot of work done in the TPP context for Canada, in the CETA context, for EU-Mexico. So a lot of the modernization, and you hear that language from all three governments, the modernization, the updating. Can we do is there low-hanging fruit based on work we've already done that we can build on and do something fairly rapidly? That is available to the governments if we choose to go there. And at this stage, we are still in Canada in consultations, and in all three countries in consultations. So the relative ambition is going to determine really what we can manage. Can we manage something very quickly? There is political will, I think, in all three countries to do that, but it's going to depend on the ambition and the willingness to take on what have been very thorny, chronic problem areas. If you are going into areas that are extremely sensitive for any of the three countries, that makes it much more difficult to conclude rapidly.
I'm told this next one has to be our last. Let's go back to Jim Berger.
I'll make it quick. Jim Berger, Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Smith and Mr. Bird, have you heard anything, any ideas from the U.S., either on your own country's trade policies or NAFTA, that if addressed would actually weaken NAFTA?
You know, at the end of the day, trade negotiations are heavily evidence-driven. And there is always going to be a process of exploring what actually works to the benefit of all three parties. And ideas that you start with aren't necessarily where you end up with in any negotiation. And I think what we have done by the ramp up that we've seen in all three countries in terms of preparing for negotiations is putting us in a good place to have an evidence-based conversation about how to reinforce the NAFTA economic space for all three parties. And I don't think we're at the stage, negotiations haven't begun, so I don't think there's been no formal proposals from the United States to Canada or otherwise, and until we're at that stage, we don't really know the level of ambition that we're going to be addressing. And Canada's prepared for many different sort of levels of ambition, and a lot depends on what is the art of the possible with our other two partners.
Anything more?
No.
I'm going to briefly do something unmoderator-ish, which is really just a little added footnote of an answer to your question and to yours. I believe some of what's been discussed with regard to Chapter 11 of NAFTA would weaken it. I've been teaching about the U.S. trade regime during most of the period since the NAFTA went into effect. And I tell my students that really, if they want to understand NAFTA, it's Chapter 11 plus everything else. That the really signal accomplishment that we had in the NAFTA was an agreement with Mexico that they would break ranks with everybody that adhered to the Calvo Doctrine. And I don't think we ever could have had the kind of relationship that we've created with Mexico if it had insisted on the right to have its actions tested only in its own national courts. I don't think any of the great story that we've seen with the NAFTA could have occurred if that fundamental thing, that was the achievement, right? We cut the tariffs, we did other stuff, but that was the big deal. And it's still the big deal. And if that were to change, then it would very substantially weaken NAFTA in what Judge refers to in his T-Talk quotes as the heartwood. Thank you very much for your attention on this panel, and we're on to the business panel next.